Hey, U.S. History students, Miss Blackman here. Let's talk about Standard 19B. So we are going to examine the Pacific Theater. There we go. Okay. Examine the Pacific Theater, including the difficulties the U.S. faced in delivering weapons, food, and medical supplies to troops. And specifically, we're going to look at the Battle of Midway, Manhattan Project, and the dropping of the atomic bombs. So, the U.S. entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that meant that the Axis powers altogether declared war on the U.S. So we're fighting on two different fronts. And these fronts are titled the Pacific Theater, as you see right here. Where's my mouse? And the European Theater over here. So fighting in the Pacific Theater presented some extra strategic difficulties and ultimately led to the use of atomic weapons to end the war. So, what type of challenges do you think there will be in the Pacific Theater? So, just looking at this map, what do you think a challenge might be? Go ahead and look at the distance that we have to travel to get to each of these. So the U.S. actually had to travel 3 times as far to get to the Pacific Theater than to get to the European Theater. Okay, so here's some other difficulties that the United States faced when it came to fighting in the Pacific Theater. So the best and the greatest amount of equipment was sent to Europe because Germany was actually seen as the immediate threat. So that was a priority. The European theater became a priority. So all the best things, all the best equipment, and all the best resources were sent to the European theater. And also, so there was little or no infrastructure to transport and store supplies in the Pacific once they arrived, which was a problem as well. So there's nowhere to store these things, and the climate of the Pacific Theater was difficult to manage, and it caused food to spoil. So it's a lot more humid, a lot hotter in the Pacific Theater, and so just to keep goods from perishing was a big deal. And remember, this is still a little bit early on in the 1900s. So, we're talking the early 1940s. And so they don't have, I'm sure, as many preservatives as we have today. So, all right, these conditions led to the Allied policy of island hopping. So they determined that this was the best strategy in the Pacific Theater. Island hopping is where you move across the islands, and each island's going to serve as a landing strip. So you kind of jump from island to island to try to get closer to Japan, taking each island over one at a time. And so you can see on this map, the blue arrows are the Allied advances, and purple is Japan's defense perimeter. Orange is actually the extent of Japanese control during this point in time. And then the orange areas of land, those are the Axis controlled nations. Whoa, what happened? Okay, sorry. And green is the Allied controlled nations. So what we kind of end up taking over, we've got Australia there, and then China, Soviet Union, India on our side. But yeah, so India because of Great Britain. Okay. Battle of Midway. So the U.S. won a sea battle against the Japanese Navy, and this was known as the Battle of Midway. This becomes a turning point in World War II. So this is where the Battle of Midway occurred on Midway Island. And Midway Island was important because it was an American refueling station for ships and airplanes. So the Japanese tried to trap and sink America's aircraft carriers near Midway Island, but the U.S. had gained intelligence information that this battle was going to occur, that the attack was coming. And so when the Japanese arrived, American forces were waiting for them. So it was no surprise. And so Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers during this battle, and the U.S. lost 1. This American victory is considered the most important naval engagement of the Pacific Campaign because it was a huge morale boost for the U.S. It showed that we could make gains in the Pacific theater and we could possibly win this. And then also, Japan never recovered fully from this defeat, which enabled the U.S. to gain control of other strategic Pacific islands. Okay, but the war in the Pacific was dragging on and on. FDR died in early 1945, and Harry Truman was the new president responsible for the conduct of the war. And the question was, should the U.S. use a new atomic weapon, or would military invasion of Japan's mainland be necessary to achieve victory in the Pacific? So we were developing an atomic weapon through the Manhattan Project. And this was very much a secret. So Manhattan Project was the code name for a secret research and development program that was assigned to build this atomic weapon during World War II. European scientists had fled Germany in the early 1930s, including our famous Albert Einstein, and they feared that German physicists were developing an atomic weapon for Hitler. So these scientists wrote to FDR and Winston Churchill, to create a similar program in the U.S. And U.S. General Leslie Groves led the development of numerous research labs where 3 atomic weapons were ultimately created. One of these research labs was in Los Alamos facility in New Mexico. So this was actually the location of the first atomic weapon test. There weren't really any people living in New Mexico during this time, so it was it wasn't populated at all, really. So it was easy to have a testing site there. And plans for the Allied invasion of Japan were underway. An estimate suggested that there could be as many as 1 million Allied casualties if we were to invade Japan by land. So the atomic weapon test was successful in the creation of 2 working bombs, and these bombs would be used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan to convince Japan to surrender. It is argued that the use of these bombs eliminated the need for an invasion of Japanese mainland and thus saved countless American lives. So August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, which was a major military center, was destroyed by the atomic bomb Little Boy. 70,000 Japanese citizens were instantly vaporized. Thousands more died from burns and the gradual killer, radiation poisoning. But the Empire of Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped in the heart of the city of Nagasaki, which was it wasn't a military center at all. Now, they weren't aiming for the city of Nagasaki, but they had to deploy the bomb there because of technical difficulties. So it wasn't meant to kill a whole bunch of civilians, but the first one did kill a whole bunch of civilians anyways, despite the fact that it was dropped at a major military center. In the city of Nagasaki, 80,000 Japanese citizens died. September 2nd, 1945, Japan finally surrendered. Allies celebrated this as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. And these dates are not something that we typically remember. August 6, 1945, September 2nd, 1945. They're not really in the minds of most Americans. But these are dates that Japan will never forget. Think of it like this, but on a much larger scale. Think of how people in America mourn 9/11 still. Every time it comes around, we have memorials to all of the fallen victims of 9/11. That was mere thousands of people not as many, not nearly as many as the amount